Dee, well, welcome to everyone. I am so delighted to be here with all of you today um, to talk about some really actionable tips for running your first fundraising campaign. And if you have run fundraising campaigns before, I hope that this training will give you some new insights on how to grow or improve what you're already doing. Um, Before we really get started, I'll just share a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from in this training here today. I've been in fundraising for over a decade now, most of that time as a consultant. I have helped organizations raise over $16 million through direct response fundraising, and I have a real passion for helping staff at organizations learn to write really well and write well for fundraising specifically. I always hope that when people leave trainings I do, they feel like they have the knowledge and the direction to go back to their organizations and to start to guide them to greater success. And I hope that that's what I'll help you all do here today through this training. And to get us started, I would love to just hear a little bit more about all of you. I know folks introduced themselves in the chat already, which is always great. I thought we'd just start with a couple quick get to know you questions just to see where everybody's coming from in terms of the types of organizations you're at. So in the chat box, you can answer with A, library, B, cultural heritage organization, or C, a friends group to let us know what kind of organization you're with. Lots of libraries, friends groups, terrific, great. So some folks are saying C's and B's, great, excellent, okay, awesome. So big cross section of different types of organizations who are on with us today, which is really exciting. I will say later on in the training, I've got lots of examples to walk you through and talk about here today when we look at different types of ways to fundraise. And I've really tried hard to get a good cross section of examples from libraries and also cultural heritage organizations. But if at any time you're having trouble seeing how a concept could apply to your type of organization, let me know so I can clarify it for you. I want you to be able to understand how something might apply to you and how you can see the takeaways being used at your organization. I do have a couple of examples from organizations that aren't either of those things, so you can see some other examples of fundraising as well. All right, so second question for you. How are you feeling about sending a fundraising appeal? A, you're feeling excited. Maybe B, you're feeling excited, but you've got questions, maybe some concerns. C, you're feeling uncertain about it. Laura, you said C, definitely some B's. Great. All right. Kenneth, A, wonderful. Glad to see that. Wonderful. Okay, so definitely a mix. I would say a lot of people I work with definitely fall in the B category. It's exciting to think about doing a fundraising campaign. There's definitely a lot of momentum for organizations that comes when you think about going out and asking people for donations. But at the same time, like I think fundraising can often become complicated very quickly. It doesn't have to be, and we will talk about that. But if you are in that C category of feeling just very uncertain about it, I hope that today's training you'll find some ways to feel a little bit more excited and see that it can be really doable to fundraise. And I'll talk about throughout the trainings on what it can look like to fundraise from where your organization is at right now. I always like to encourage people to think about what your capacity is, what your resources are, and how to work from that place rather than creating a really aspirational plan for a fundraising campaign that would be totally nice to do if you were like a huge endowed university. But for your type of organization, maybe that's like actually not doable at this time. So we'll talk about that as we go and hopefully help you see where you can pull some of these concepts through into your work now and feel a lot more confident with where you're going in all of this. All right, so we're going to start today's training by just talking about some key basics around fundraising campaigns. Fundraising, I always think of as a bit of an art, a bit of a science, and some kind of mix of those two things, depending on what specifically you're working on in your fundraising campaign. But what we're going to talk about here in this part of the training is the mechanisms and the tactics by which we can go out and ask for money, as this can really impact the success of your campaign. So I always think about this as the how, like what are we going to do out in the world when we get out there to go ask for money, the how and the what pieces. So I'll talk about this a little bit first. As you might know from your own experience, maybe your work experience, or even your experience as a donor, there's a lot of ways to fundraise, right? You probably think of a whole list of those things. And over in the chat, I would love for you to share some of the ways that to fundraise that maybe you're personally familiar with from your work, or maybe there are ways you've been asked for money before as a donor. So go ahead and type in some ideas there and we'll talk about some of those. Yeah, Terry said mailing, definitely. I just got some direct mail last week in my inbox. Sarah, 5Ks, yeah, so event-based fundraising, definitely another one. Allison, yeah, selling discarded books. So that's more of like an earned revenue type model for fundraising. Um, yeah, direct asks, raffles. I definitely ran one of those for a client last year. Selling bricks, Susan. Yeah, so there's definitely things like that where I always think about those like selling bricks, selling naming rights, anything like that as more like incentive-based fundraising. Silent auctions, yeah, something like that might be part of an event-based fundraising. Definitely. So lots of things. You guys are saying, which is great. Gloria, you send a mailing every year to businesses in East Rochester. Great. Yeah. So lots of you were saying mail, which is an important part of this. But I would just say, like, as you can probably see through some of the things coming in through the chat, there's a lot of different ways that we can fundraise. I always tell people, whatever it is your goal, whatever your goal might be, there's probably a dozen ways to get there. Some that are going to be easier and more effective, some that might end up just becoming a really big barrel of monkeys for your organization. And what we're going to focus on here today is fundraising that's often referred to as the annual appeal. And I'll talk a little bit about that and what goes into it. And we'll talk about why this kind of framing for a campaign and type of fundraising can be more effective than other things that you might do. If you're not familiar with the concept of an annual appeal, let's just do a quick rundown of this. So for a lot of organizations, an annual appeal is sometimes the largest fundraising campaign for the organization every year. I used to work in university advancement years ago, and we would do an annual alumni appeal. That was our primary direct mail campaign every year. By far the largest direct mailing we would do. I've also worked for organizations where we would do quarterly campaigns to donors. It really depends on what your organization is doing and the sophistication level that it's at with its fundraising program. I would say there's not one right or wrong way to do this, but rather just figuring out a frequency that will work really well for your organization. The appeal often seeks to raise funds for a specific project or general operating funds. That's typically how these kinds of appeals work. I will often get asked, maybe you're thinking this question, but how can we ask people just to donate to operating for our organization? You absolutely can. It all comes down to the kind of story you tell and the messaging you have about your organization. And we'll talk about that in the next little part of the training. But you can absolutely write a really compelling annual appeal that makes a general ask for somebody to donate to your organization rather than to a very specific project or initiative that you might have going on. And the last piece I'll just say about the annual appeal is that it really requires a direct response mechanism, such as a letter or an email, to get a response from potential donors. And this is a really important one. And this is what we're going to primarily talk about here today, is the direct response piece of running a really good first fundraising campaign. Direct response is really essential in all of this. And let me tell you a little bit about why I think that and why I hope that this will be one of the most important points I can drive home for you here in this training. It is really essential. And I say that because if you think about other types of fundraising that you could do or other things that theoretically you could do to raise donations, like posting something on social media, maybe hosting an event, direct response is about getting right in front of people and giving them an immediate call to action and an immediate way to answer that call to action, usually in the form of a donation reply device, like something you might see in a letter. If it's an email, it's sending them to a landing page. So we're trying to get people to take action very quickly. Some common types of direct response are direct mail, email, and phone is also considered direct response, but I would say for our purposes today, we won't talk about that. That can be a very expensive endeavor for organizations. Over time, direct response fundraising relies more and more on donor data to do things like segmentation and to do really targeted asks to them. But you do not have to start in that place. You can start where you are with the information you already have, the donor data you might have, the lists you might have of people you can reach out to, and build on that as you go with each campaign. And the good news is you might already be doing direct response and just not know it. So you might be doing things like sending out, something in the mail periodically. You might have an email newsletter list. You might even send out newsletters. And I'd be curious to hear in the chat for those of you who do those things, of those three channels I just mentioned, mail, email, newsletters, are you already doing any of those things? Maybe you already are, which is great. And if you are already using some of those direct response mechanisms, your work is likely just going to be tweaking what you're already doing to optimize the amount of money that you can raise through those channels. And if you're not currently doing that, we'll talk more about how you can get started and how you build those audiences towards the end of the training. Cindy, you said you're doing all of them. Yeah, Lisa, mail and email. Great. Allison, more was required to ask people at least 5 times for money, even after they told us you were sick. Didn't have the funds. Yeah, Claire, Facebook, does that count? I would say a little less so. If you are doing direct response, I think that certainly social media can be a part of the marketing that supports campaigns, but generally it's going to be a little less effective. Allison, phone banking. Yes, there's definitely phone banking, right? Yeah, just email. Great. Yeah, and if you only have one of these channels established right now, great. Keep running with that. Again, like start where you are, work with what you've got. I think that that's a really important point that I just want to drive home. I hope that at the end of the training, you do not feel like you have to start a new email account, start like acquiring addresses. You can do those things incrementally and over time, but we're going to start with what we've got and work from there. Yeah, Charlene, so our group did mailings in the past, but everyone that was involved in that left the group, so you're starting all over. I understand that. I had a client like that who I've been working with for the last 2 years who has an email list that once upon a time was doing a lot, and then they've had staff turnover. The momentum kind of got lost. They didn't really know what they were doing with it. And so they kind of had to go back to square one to figure out what it was they were doing. Yeah, great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Those are really great answers. And good to see where all of you are coming from with this. And it's nice to see that some of you already have some of these pieces in place to work with. So before we talk about what goes into an annual appeal, which is what we're going to spend most of our time on here today, I just want to mention that, your annual appeal, your fundraising campaign, as I said before, can be as complicated or as simple as you make it. That's a choice that you can make as you build this out. I've worked with organizations who only send out one direct mail letter, and that's the extent of their fundraising campaign for that year. It's worked for them. It's very manageable. It's something that's very doable that they can execute on. I have also worked with organizations who have done complex multi-week, multi-channel campaigns that combine letters and email and other kinds of marketing outreach that take us months to plan and many weeks to kind of roll out. Is there one that's better than another? Not necessarily. I always think that the right answer is what's going to work for your organization and be really manageable and doable for you. So I would encourage you to just keep that in mind. I know sometimes when I go to trainings, I pick up lots of information and I think I have to do all these things now. I have this whole list of to-dos, but just kind of check yourself there and see where you're at. And allow yourself to kind of go from there. So before we get into telling your story and the anatomy of writing really great direct response, I just want to do a quick check-in with folks, see if you have any questions so far about the concept of the annual appeal or the idea of direct response. I see there is one question in the Q&A, so I'll go ahead and answer that. Do personalized notes on letters to people on the board, board members know, improve yield? That's a really good question. I think that sometimes personalization can absolutely improve the ROI that you have in direct mail. I think it depends on the context and the type of relationship that's there. And I would say the wonderful thing about any kind of fundraising campaign is that you can often test and see what, if that's working for you. You could do your next campaign where you try some personalized notes or some different personalization on there and see if it got you an improved yield over the one before. A lot of times you're only going to know the answer to that and your audience's response if you try it once or twice and see what happens. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I would say I personally like direct response because I feel like there's a lot of very specific measurable things that we can look at. So over campaigns, we can compare things, we can kind of dial into little details to see if we can get improvements over time and test things. It's a lot of, I personally find it to be a lot of fun. So not everybody else does, but I do also enjoy the copywriting part of that, which is what we're going to talk about next. So we've kind of set the stage just a little bit here of talking about the importance of using some kind of direct response tool to raise money. What we're going to talk about for the next large part of our training is really what you write in that to your prospective donors or even your existing donors. This is about the story you're going to tell about your cause, about the ask, about the need that you have. What you write matters a really great deal. And so what we're going to do in this section is I'm going to break down some foundational pieces of actually how to write your appeal and talk about what they look like. We'll look at lots of examples. I'm also going to give you some time to do some thinking and brainstorming about this for your organization so you can walk away with some ideas that you can continue to develop after the training. I think that in my experience of training people over the years and working with people around writing, whether it's providing coaching or mentorship on it, I know that a lot of people have blocks around thinking like, I'm like not a good writer. This is not really my thing, but I have to do it for my organization. Like I'm the person who has to write this thing and get it out to people. And I would just say to you, writing is one of those things, especially writing for fundraising. It's a very different kind of writing. This is not like creative writing. It is something where there are rules that you can learn, guidelines that you can continue to apply to the writing to help you figure out what to say and how to say it. And you'll continue to practice and you can continue to get better. And I think that just having that mindset that it's something you can improve on and it is a very learnable skill, I hope will give you a little bit more confidence going into this if you're feeling like, I'm not so sure about writing this thing or what I'm going to say to my audience. It is something that you could figure out. And if you have questions as we go along, this will be a great opportunity to ask them. And I can definitely try to help you work through some of those questions that you may have. So to start, there are two really essential pieces of an annual appeal when we're writing to somebody about donating to our organization. They are a compelling reason to give and a sense of urgency. These are two things that you need to really move people towards making that donation. I read a lot of fundraising appeals every year, and sometimes I see an appeal that has like a pretty solid reason to give, but no urgency whatsoever. Like they haven't given me a reason to donate today as opposed to a year from now or never even, which is not something we want. And on the flip side, I definitely see appeals where there's this like great sense of urgency, like there's something going on, there's like a really strong call to action, but not really a strong, compelling reason to give. Like that part will often be weak. I think that if you can do the thinking about this and the brainstorming about these two things before you go into writing the appeal, you'll be really well set up to figure out what it is you want to say throughout the appeal, because these two things will give you a lot of guidance. And so we're going to talk about these, look at a number of examples, and also do some of our own work in this as well. Okay, so let's talk about the compelling reason to give. So I always think that the compelling reason to give ties into a concept in nonprofit programming that we often call the theory of change. So what is it that we're trying to change in the world? What is it we're trying to do through our work? And in fundraising, our compelling reason to give is really explaining how giving makes a difference. So what does donating facilitate? What change does it help facilitate in the community, within your organization? And there might be a lot of different things that it can facilitate, but you really want to have one solid answer to that question, why should I give? And one of the things I like to do around this is really spend some time digging into that answer a little bit more. So when I sit down to start working on an appeal to try to tell the story of a project, I'll say like, why should someone give to this? And I'll come up with a reason. I'll do some writing about it. And then I'll look at that answer and I'll say, okay, but why? Or I'll ask myself, but that matters because, or why does this matter? And I'll just keep kind of digging down a couple little layers to try to get to that compelling reason to give. Sometimes we'll have a good answer the first time around, like I would say like a solid B answer, but we could just like keep inquiring a little bit more and digging into that reasoning for giving. And I think that this is the place where I would encourage you to probably give yourself the most time. Time will be your friend in this process, because you may not come to like the perfect compelling reason to give in one day or in one like sitting session of writing. you might need a couple days to like mull it over, come back to it. You might want to get some feedback or input from other people or constituents that you might work with, to brainstorm with them and get their advice on it. So being able to do that is something that's really powerful. So what I want to do is just look at some different examples that I pulled for all of us. So we'll look at these here on the next couple slides. I have 4 in total. And what we're going to do actually is do some critiques of them. I find that one of the ways that we can start to really improve our writing is actually by looking at what others are writing and critiquing that and pulling like what's working from this and what's not working from that, and starting to think about how we can apply that to our own writing as well. So I'm not going to rip these to shreds or anything, but I just want to give you some things for us to talk about, and we'll use the chat again. So if you want to share your thoughts on this, if it's good, if it's bad, what you like, what you don't, I'll also share my thoughts on them as well. But we'll go through and we can also kind of compare and contrast some of these different examples. All right, so I'll go ahead and read this one for us here on the screen. So this one says, as the busiest library in British Columbia, we're not only a cornerstone for Vancouver's neighborhoods, we connect people to each other in a world of information and literacy. So what do we think about this as a compelling reason to give? And I will say, sorry, before some of you answer, I pulled all of these examples from different websites giving pages. So these are pieces of copy specifically from fundraising assets. So this is what you might find if you go to this organization's donation page. What do we think about this? Does this feel compelling? If you saw this, would you think, I understand why they want me to give? Yeah, Claire, I guess I would wonder what they need or want money for. Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, let's see. Lots of things coming in here. So yeah, Susan, this is very standard for a library role. People will ask, how is this different from what I pay taxes for? Yeah, excellent question. So those are something that yeah, so a couple of you have said it's quite general. So I think that that's a really excellent observation, that it's like, could use something a little bit more specific. And this is where the tip that I gave you just before might come in. So let me just go back to that one. So as I said here, so we connect people to each other in a world of information and literacy. Well, why does that matter? Like, that is where I would ask that question, so that, or that matters because. I think that that's where we can kind of dig into that a little bit more and use that exercise to really like get into something that's a little bit more specific and maybe a little bit more compelling and hopefully less generic, because right, like this is something that could be applicable to any library and on their website. I think that's very true. Great. So a lot of you shared really great things. Yeah. And I will, I'll say that when we talk about the anatomy of an appeal, I'll give you more specific examples that actually draw in more specific stories. These are a little bit light on that in these examples here. All right, so this one is from a small local art gallery where I live on Vancouver Island. This one's a little bit longer. So I would love for you to take a look at this one. And again, just tell me, what do you think about this as a compelling reason to give? What reason to give are you picking up from this one? Oops, sorry about that. It's going back and forth here. So I'll just read the first part here for folks who are listening in. Over the past year and a half, the pandemic has presented many challenges for the gallery, and it hasn't been easy, but it has fostered a wealth of creativity as we found new and innovative ways to bring our art into the community, whether in person or online. And at the end of the day, though, our revenue and visitors numbers have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. We now need your support more than ever. Your generosity helps to fund important exhibitions such as Denise Tomaso's Odyssey, organized by the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, open from November 2021 to February 2022. Your donations also help to create an engaging selection of in-person and digital programming. It gives a couple of examples there. What do we think of this one? Yeah, Claire, so you like this one a lot. There's a specificity, the urgency of the problem. Absolutely, yeah, there's something very clear about this, I think. It is long, I will say, like for like copy at the top of a landing page or a donation page, it's pretty long, but I do think that the specificity of it is really great. And you could see how you could start to tell more stories about this. You could develop this into a longer appeal letter if you needed to. Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I'm glad to see that some of you are picking up on this. There's a good sense of urgency. Allison, yeah, you're nervous about mentioning your numbers of visitors not returning, like it's negative thinking. And can people think, what will that have people think? Yeah, I think that that's a good point. I think that with whatever it is we're talking about in our appeal, there's always going to be positive or negative ways to message that. So, for this example, I think one of the things that they do well in presenting like what I would call like quote unquote bad news, like bad news, our revenue and visitor numbers haven't returned to normal levels. However, like we are continuing to try to figure this out. Like we're continuing to try to bring new in-person and digital programming to people. We're trying to bring new and interesting exhibits to people that might draw people back in, and that's going to help us get back towards these goals. So they're not just leaving us with this place of like, oh, like this terrible scenario is happening, like give us money so we can figure it out. Like they actually have a proposed solution, and there's some specificity to that, which I think is really good. Great. All right. So I'm glad that some of you saw the differences in those. I have two more that we'll just kind of quickly go through. So this one's from the Seattle Public Library. Your gift keeps the Seattle Public Library accessible to all people of all ages, backgrounds, income levels can access and enjoy the library. So I'll just tell you, I think this one has the ability to be way more compelling than it is. Like it's pretty brief. And in terms of messaging, like the messaging point I pick up on is this value of accessibility. Like that's something that's important to the library. It's something that might be important to their donors. However, again, like this question of like, but why is accessibility important? Like I would kind of like dig into that a little bit more to think about, can I position that a little bit differently? And again, come back to something that's a little bit more specific and more urgent in how we frame that for folks. All right, and one final example I'll just give you all. This is from a library up in Sacramento. When we walk through the doors, we know that we're going to make a difference in the lives of the public that walk through the doors with us. And whether we're building a community of readers, bringing topical discussions to the forefront, or advancing education for all ages. Walk through the doors with us and make a difference. Keep Sacramento moving forward by making a tax-deductible gift today. What do you all think about this one? Yeah, Claire, were these put on static giving pages? I believe so. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't put the references and sources for these ones, that I can add those in later for folks if you'd like to take a look at where these all came from. Yeah, Allison, nice incentive with the tax deductible gift. Yeah, I think it's always good to remind people of that. I will say for this one, for me, like when I think about what works for this in terms of what makes it compelling and interesting, like I think that there is something engaging about the writing, like with the visual of walking through the door, like that kind of evokes something in your mind. But I don't necessarily know if the idea of like when we walk through the doors, we know we're going to make a difference in the lives of the public that's walking through the doors with us is as compelling as it could be. I think it's an interesting idea. I think that, I think that it's something that could be like finessed a little bit more. Yeah. And I think Matthew, like, again, like who's the we? I think that that's also a question I had as well in this one. And, of course, I think with any kind of fundraising material, like we don't want to leave people with questions. Like that's like the last thing we want to do. I always tell people, the last thing you want to do is have people start asking questions about the thing that they're reading, because that's the minute we've lost them. Like we want them to have no questions at all, for things to be crystal clear, for them to know exactly what we're talking about. So yeah, so several different examples there for you to think about. And hopefully give you some ideas of like things that are working, things that are not working in these, and how you can think about how you may want to do this for your organization, which leads us into our first activity that I want to give us a couple minutes to do. So these will be on your worksheets for this workshop. And I know Christy posted a link to this in the chat box a little while ago. You'll find a space for this at the first page up at the top under the activity, your compelling reason to give. So what I'd like to do is give you a couple minutes to think about this. We've looked at some examples, and I would love for you to think about, why should somebody give to your organization? What is the best reason you can give them for that? And what we can do is we'll take some time to go ahead and do this. Christy just posted the link to the worksheets one more time. If you haven't printed them out, no problem. You can also just write down some answers on your page. And as you do that, I would encourage you to just ask yourself that why, or think about that matters. And that matters because, to kind of go a layer deeper in that compelling reason to give. And if anybody wants to take a look at the examples we went through for reference, just let me know. I can flip back to some of those as well if that's helpful for you. Yeah. Oh, great question. I'll go ahead and answer this question from Claire while people are kind of doing some of their thinking here. Would there be a different tactic here since somebody has purposely visited library.org/donate? Um, Claire, maybe you can clarify for me. By different tactic, you mean since they specifically went to the donate page as opposed to like just going to a general page on your library website? If you have a second, you want to clarify that, that would be awesome. Yeah, okay, as opposed to a direct request for running. Sure, yes. I think that in some ways the language you might use on a donation page can be simpler because people have already self-selected to get to that page. So they're already there. Yeah, whereas if you mail somebody for a letter asking for support, like there's going to be more legwork involved in convincing them. Obviously, you have a lot more real estate in being able to write something on that letter. The one thing I would say though, like when you think about, like your giving page, a direct mail letter, or an email, you do want there to be some consistency in language, right? Like, so you wouldn't want somebody to read your direct mail letter, go to your website to make a donation, and the language and messaging be completely different from what you read in the letter. You'd want to have some congruency there. And sometimes it's as simple as just taking the call to action from your direct mail letter and using that same action, the same language for the call to action on your donation page. So I know that wasn't a lot of time, but hopefully a little bit of time for some wheels to get turning. And as I said, if you would like to get some feedback, do some brainstorming with me, feel free to go ahead and raise a hand and we can definitely call on you. And while folks are thinking about that, what I'll go ahead and do is just talk a little bit about the urgency piece, and then we can go to some questions and some examples again. So the other piece that we want to include in our appeal is urgency. Urgency is such an important part of fundraising, right? This is what is going to help people give today to a specific campaign and not donate, as I said, like a month from now, a year from now, or maybe never. Urgency really drives people to do that. And there are lots of ways that you can create urgency, sometimes a deadline, right? So I always think about like a really obvious one is December 31st. It's the end of the fiscal tax year, the last date for somebody to get a tax receipt for that specific year. That's a hard deadline, right? So that's a really good example. There might be a limited opportunity like a matching gift, and that might also have a deadline associated with it. The stakes of the problem and how it applies to donors can also create urgency. This is a totally different type of example, but I see this a lot with environmental organizations. If there's a tie-in to climate change or other types of work around that, there's a real clear stake of how it might apply to donors, and that creates some urgency in their appeal. The other way to create some urgency, and I think that this is like a maybe more intermediate advanced way to do it, is connecting it to something in the news. So if there's something topically relevant that ties into what you're doing, this can be a really good way to create some relevancy and tie into a sense of urgency for why what you do is so important. Again, I always come back though to this question of urgency. Like it should continue to help answer this question of why should I give? Why should I give today being a really important piece of that. I'm just going to check the chat here because I know a couple people have typed in some things. Yeah. Allison. Yeah, Allison raised your hand. Okay. No problem. Allison, I will take a look at yours here in just a second. I'm going to get people thinking about this. So one of the other things I want to give you an opportunity to do is just think about what you might use as some urgency for your fundraising appeal. So again, there's a space to just do some brainstorming on that first page of your worksheets. I would encourage you to think about like 5 different ways you could create urgency. That might seem like a big list. You're only going to use one, but just challenge your creative muscles here for a minute or two and just write down a couple of ideas that you might have for this. I was thinking the other day, I was doing some brainstorming with a client of mine who is going to run an appeal for a kids program that's going to start up in September. And their kind of deadline sense of urgency that they're creating is that they want to be prepared when the new school year starts. This appeal isn't going out for another couple months, but they want to be prepared to help kids when they're going back to school in September. And so that means they want to have the funding and the resources and the program all set up in place so that they can hit the ground running when kids are back in school after Labor Day, which is a great sense of urgency. Like there's a deadline to that and a reason for people to help them now. Okay. All All right, Allison. Yeah. So my line I would like to workshop is that we need to raise funds to help upgrade our Wi-Fi so that our students and community members can have access to the internet for research, job hunting, and making use of our ebook collection. Okay, great. So you have a really good what. So that is what you want people to donate to. So for this, I would just think about like, why is this important? So access to the internet for research, for job hunting. Like, let's just take a specific example. So what is like, if somebody doesn't have access to the internet for job hunting, what happens without that? Yeah, in your college library. Okay, great. It's like, what happens without that? Well, it's harder for them to find a job. Like maybe they have a more difficult time transitioning, from college into the workforce. There's like a number of issues that can arise from that, right? So that's like something that you could think about there. And again, like this question of research. So like, yeah, job hunt. Yeah, exactly. Job hunting is nearly impossible today without internet. That's a really great, a really strong sentence that you could use to talk about why that's so important. And I would also say to add to that, like how many places are like how easy is it to go out and find like reliable good internet with computers that you can actually use immediately, right? Like your library at the college is one of those places, but like where else on campus could somebody do that, or where else in the community, like is that really easy for people? And again, like that kind of creates the necessity of what it is that you're providing there. Yeah. Okay, I hope that's helpful. But again, I would come back to like these other pieces of like research. So like if somebody didn't have access to Wi-Fi and computers through your library at the college and they couldn't do research, like what is the impact or the repercussion on their educational experience for that, for example? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right, let me just look at some other examples here. Yvonne, I'll just go ahead and read yours. So the library provides a wealth of community and shared resources that equalizes the playing field. This matters because we provide free access to books, technology, events, and activities. And when everyone has the same access, we lift up, when everyone has the same access, we lift everyone up and our community is enhanced. Great, I love that. That's really good. Yeah. Tammy, yes, you're having trouble with the urgency for increasing operational um, a budget without bad mouthing the organization. Fair enough, right? That's sometimes a fine line to walk. I understand that. So, Tammy, how would I approach this? So I would encourage you to thinking about the positives. What is possible when we have more money? Like you don't have to focus on like the why, like why we don't have money, why it's a problem. Like sure, that could be a tone and a messaging direction you could go, but you don't have to dwell on that, like in how you write about this. You could just talk about the hopeful, optimistic possibilities and that kind of messaging line of like, if we have increased operating budget, here are, X, Y, and Z things that we can do. And here's like the importance or impact to the community around that. That is one direction that you could go with that. Okay, great. Well, those were all really good examples. I hope that got some of you thinking a little bit more about your own examples and yeah, and where you can go with this. And we can definitely circle back to some of these and workshop a bit more. I do just want to pause. We're going to talk a little bit more now about the anatomy of the appeal. And I'll just ask, if anybody has kind of general questions about these concepts, maybe ones that are less specific to your organization, but if you have general questions, it's a great time to ask them. You can definitely, we'll keep rolling. And if questions come in, we'll answer those. So I want to say though, from what I saw in the chat, a lot of you are doing great work and great thinking. And I hope that you feel like you can keep going. Like this is the beginning of what you're going to do with writing this appeal letter or email. We've really laid the groundwork for the fundraising campaign and thinking about those two key pieces. And now we're going to talk about what's actually going to go in the letter, how we are going to communicate this compelling reason to give and the urgency. So I'm going to walk you through how to do this and walk you through the structure and appeal, the structure that I use when I write for clients. And I'll just start with an overview of what this is, and then we'll talk through each section. I have lots of examples to go through that we can look at. So this is broadly, and not broadly, generally how I write an appeal letter. I think about there being a hook, some sort of explainer, like kind of that middle section, an ask, generally a second explainer and a story, another ask, and then a thank you as we wrap up the letter and the or the email that we're sending out. So I'll talk about what each of these parts looks like. We're going to walk through this and look at these things so that you can kind of see how they come together. I find that when folks have a structure to kind of follow, a really effective structure for fundraising letters or emails, it becomes easier to write. Like you now are not sitting down trying to figure out, okay, well, like, how do I say this? How do I structure it? What goes where? And I'll break down what goes in each of these sections and how you could start to think about this. And if you are feeling overwhelmed, if you sit down to write, I would encourage you to just go section by section. Don't think about the letter as a whole or the email as a whole. Just think, okay, I'm here to just write the hook. I'm just here to write the ask or like the second story that might go in this letter. That can make it a little bit more manageable. So just kind of baby stepping it. So we're going to start with a hook, though. This is, I think, always the most important part of a fundraising appeal letter or an email. Establishing the problems or the stakes right off the bat in your appeal is super important. And there are a lot of ways to do this. It does not have to be a crisis or an emergency situation. I see a lot of appeal letters sometimes where it's like, I always call it like the house is on fire messaging. Like, like that can work, sure, but like it's not going to work every time you send out an appeal. Like you have to have something compelling and different that's going to hook people in. And so I wanted to pull an example from a library that kind of gives you an idea of what this hook or problem can look like. That's really, I think, rooted in like a specific story about someone. The stakes here in this example you can see on the slide are a staff member crying. So, right, like our curiosity is piqued here. Like these people were like, well, why is this person crying? What's going on here? What's the story? And we might be drawn in by the emotional stakes of the scene as opposed to the factual stakes. And of course, you could certainly look at the facts and draw people in that way. So, for instance, I'm just gonna look back at this. Leona said like shortfalls in our budget due to COVID. Like, sure, that could definitely be part of your hook and how you kind of frame why you're writing to somebody on that particular day. And definitely something that that you can draw into there as well as the emotional part of the problem. I think that the thing that I'll say about the hook, I always spend most of my time writing this part of a letter that it's only ever a couple sentences, but an email or direct mail, these first few sentences are probably going to make or break whether somebody is going to keep reading or click over to a donate page. And so I really want to make sure that they are as compelling as possible and really get into the point. I find for a lot of organizations, when I look at appeal letters, they take a long time to get to the point. Like there's a lot of meandering to get into like the most important thing that we need to tell people. Move it up to the top. Tell people right away. Don't bury the lead. There's really no point in doing that. Yeah, so, and I see a lot of questions coming here. I'm just going to keep going here and I'll circle back to some of these questions here in a second. But I just want to kind of cover some of this first. So the explainer, let's talk about the explainer, which is the next part of this. This often is anywhere from, I would say, at least one paragraph to sometimes two or three, depending on the medium in which you're writing. Email, it'll be a little shorter. Direct mail letter will be longer. That will make a difference. But the explainer is essentially where you are telling people why you're writing. And you really want to give them a clear reason to care and a problem that needs to be solved. So this is where some of the work you did earlier in this training about your compelling reason to give will come in. Like that should be the basis of your explainer. And in the explainer part of your letter, you are just pulling that apart and telling the story of that compelling reason to give. You want to wrap some narrative around that and help people kind of contextualize it and see why that is so compelling and so important. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. And I'll just kind of walk you through these. We can also talk about them too as a group. So here we go. Let me move my screen around here and I will read this one for you. So this one is from the National Museum of the American Indian. This one says, each time another visitor passes through the doors of the National Museum of the American Indian, we challenge them to leave their preconceived notions behind because the very future of Native communities depends on it. And that's where you come in. I'm asking you today to take a stand for justice and truth for Native communities by joining the National Museum of American Indians as a member. So I would love for you to tell me in the chat what you think about this as an explainer. What are you picking up on this as the problem that's in here and the proposed solution? Do you feel like you can kind of parse that out of this? Yeah, Joan, you think most people don't even read a letter, they see who it's from and they either decide to give or they tear it up. I think that can be true sometimes. I mean, I think one of the benefits with email fundraising is certainly you can see people who are opening that and definitely get some reassurance that people are reading it. I think you're right. Sometimes people have already made up their minds, right? Depending on the context in which we're asking in the campaign, for sure. Yeah, Susan, you think this is a big ask? Sure. Yeah, Leona, this explainer is very moving for you. Great, I'm glad to see that. Yeah, I think this is actually a really strong appeal letter. I would encourage you to check this whole one out. I've left a link here. You can check this out after the training. And yes, the stakes are very high. So I think it is a really good one, though. I think it's I think it does a good job of taking something that could be a very complicated issue and really distilling it down, right? Like this is not a huge word count. And yet we can take something really significant from this, which I think is really powerful. And what I hope that you'll take away from this is that you don't have to be super wordy with how you do your explainer. There can be something that's really compelling in the brevity of this. They've really chosen their words wisely. They've really gotten to the point quickly, and they've moved right into an ask. I think that the thing that I appreciate about this as a writer is the really smooth flow from the explainer of the stakes and the problem right into an ask. Like there's a really nice pivot into that, the statement, and that's where you come in. Like it's telling us, okay, we've given you a problem, like this thing is happening, and now you, the reader, the donor, here's a way you can do something about it, right? Which is, I think, always a hallmark of a really good letter or email is when we pivot into that ask very, very seamlessly. Yeah. Yeah, Matthew, this is well written and very personal. I statements. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely written in a first person. I can't remember if it's like the museum director or the executive director who's the signatory on that. But yeah, absolutely. I think that makes the difference, the types of pronouns that we use in there. All right, let me give you another example here. We can just talk about, this one is from a library. So, and a little bit more topical. I know some of you mentioned the impacts of COVID on your organizations. And I'll just go ahead and read this one here, and we can talk about this in the chat here. So the COVID pandemic has brought financial challenges to the library because our most successful fundraising events each year, events such as the spring book sale, spring book and plant sale, garden tour, and fall sale could not be run. To try to make up for this difference, we were able to secure some funding from grants and discretionary spending that has been reduced, and discretionary spending has been reduced wherever possible without compromising the library's ability to serve the community safely. Thankfully, a few vendors have provided pro bono services, and some of our operating expenses have been reduced due to renovation efficiencies. All of those efforts have enabled the library to remain solvent for 2020. However, 2021 remains uncertain. What do you think about this one? Thinking about it compared to the last one we looked at as an explainer, do you understand it? Yeah, Allison, you like that this one shows the library has done as much as it can before asking for donations. Sure, yes, I think it does provide some really useful context. Yeah, Michael, there needs to be an action statement. Yes, I agree. I do think that there needs to be something a little bit more like, okay, here's what's happened, and now what are we going to do about it? Sure, it's like, yeah, the future of the library remains uncertain in some ways, but like, what's the plan? Like if it's seeming a little uncertain. Yes, yeah, Lori, you picked up exactly something I wanted to point out. It's not as moving as the membership one until the last bit, right? So I would say this is a really good example of something where an explainer buries the lead. Like there's a really punchy, good piece of text. It's way at the bottom. I would move this up to the top and really get people engaged with this much earlier. So one tip I would have for you as you're writing is when you read a draft of something, an easy way to improve it can often just be moving sentences or paragraphs around, reordering what you've done so that something that is really great can be up at the top and not buried way down in the bottom. Sometimes finding those sentences can be hard. So that can be where a second set of eyes can be really helpful. And I would encourage you to seek out those other inputs if you can, to find some assistance with that. Yeah, which is great. So I'm glad some of you picked up on some of those differences there. So that gets us into our first ask. So we've written our hook and we've written an explainer, and now we're going to make an ask. We are going to tell people, now that we've given them a reason to read, established a problem, and shown the solution, we want to tell them what to do about that. And the obvious thing to do about that is making a donation. The ask is super important. I would say a lot of appeals I read, this part often gets watered down. And I always feel like, oh, like it's so unfortunate because it just undermines the momentum that you've built up in your appeal. So let's look at this example here that I have on the screen. And I'll just go ahead and read this for you and we can talk about this a little bit. So together, your contributions will support the Halleckville Museum Farms recovery from the trials of the pandemic and enable us to continue to inspire future generations to take Long Island back to its family farming roots and explore their relevance today. Help us create a vibrant, active, and inclusive Halleckville community rooted in history and focused on the future. So that was the ask in this particular appeal. If any of you have thoughts or want to ask about that, yeah, Lori, that I could have left out in that entire last sentence. Potentially, yeah. That's one way to do some editing of this for sure. Yeah, I think the first sentence is really long. It's quite a long run-on sentence. I probably would have chopped that up just to like make it a little easier to read. And I also think that it's important to actually have like something like make a donation today to help us do this. And like this is a little general, but like actually having that specific like please make your donation today, really specific call to action in there. This is kind of getting to it, like the help us create a vibrant, active, and inclusive community. Well, it's like, okay, well, help us, but like, help us how? So again, like really being specific and saying, help us by making a donation is something that I would do to change this. And I'm going to give you another example. So the example I just looked at is here on the top of this slide. There's another example right below it. I'm going to go ahead and read this. And for those of you who want to share your thoughts on it, please do. This one says, if possible, please join us as we celebrate Library Giving Day on April 6th by making a tax-deductible donation. In hard times and in easier times, our community is our most valuable asset. We appreciate and value your continued support as we look forward to a better, smoother future. Great. So two different examples for us to look at here. And Anne, just looking at your comment there, take us back, can motivate people who want to go back to pre-pandemic times. Sure, yes. Yeah, there's definitely some like nostalgia, some emotion that gets evoked with that. So I'll say with this example that I have up here on this slide, the if possible phrase, I would take that out. I know sometimes it can be tempting to add some like tentative, softer language in a fundraising appeal because you may not want to offend people who may not be able to give. You might just be feeling sensitive about it. You want to be sensitive towards individual situations. I think that this really like undermines it a little bit. I personally would, yeah, just take it out. And yeah, I think Christy, I would probably do the same thing you're suggesting of just start with join us as we celebrate Library Giving Day, da 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 da. So that's an easy, like quick edit. And sometimes if one of the things you can do as you read through your appeals and you're looking at examples is just think about like, how can I just make this language more concise and stronger? A lot of times just editing out some words will really make a big difference there. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the second part of our letter, which is the second explainer or a story. Sometimes it's a specific story about a person or a project. But this is our chance for people who are unconvinced by our first part of our letter and have kept reading past that ask to convince the unconvinced. You might think, okay, well, people are actually going to read the second part of the letter. They will. I look at the analytics for one of our clients who we do email fundraising for. We have a lot of people who click on that second ask at the bottom of an email. Most will click on the first, but there are definitely people who keep reading on, and we want to make sure we give them the best information we can to make a decision about giving. So one of the things I think about with the second explainer is that I want to use a slightly different approach than I used on the top part of the appeal. It's still on message. It's still the same tone. Like I don't want to take a right turn and go a totally different direction. So definitely some flow and some consistency there. But this is where I just want to help people understand a little bit more. And I think in this particular part of the letter, it can be extremely valuable to introduce an individual story to give readers a very concrete example of what you're talking about. Sometimes when we talk about programs, we talk about the need or the problem we're having. It can be abstract to people, like absolutely. And so by sharing a story about an individual, a person, a project, That's where we can really help people understand the specifics of what it is we're getting at, the specific impact, whatever that might be. And I think that that's a really valuable thing that we can do in that part of the letter. And I'll definitely share some examples with you on that. So here's an example of what this second hook or explainer could look like. So I shared this example earlier on when we talked about the hook, but this is the rest of this particular letter. So it reads, on that particular day, Owen wasn't in the library with his mom. He was here on a school visit at a part of the library's partnership with the local school district. Miss Mary, who was the staff member, hadn't seen Owen for a few months, but that did not stop him from walking up to her with confidence and asking for a book about planets. After giving him several books from which to choose, Mary came into my office with those tears of joy. She was amazed at Owen's transformation and was convinced the library had a hand in his development. Mary had just witnessed how a toddler, once frightened of being in a room with strangers, could become a confident and inquisitive 6-year-old. I think this is really great. I'm curious to hear what some of you think about this. I think it's a really wonderful example of what an individual's story can look like. Yeah, I feel like very heartwarming, right? And just a really wonderful example of what it can look like to kind of weave in a story about constituents, people you're serving through your organization, to really show the impact and really make that ask and that letter that you're writing to somebody so much more compelling. I think this is a really lovely example, which was why I wanted to share it with you all. Um, but yeah, I was trying to think of things I would do to improve it. I don't think there's really anything I would change about this personally when I read it, and I read it a bunch of times. But I think this particular bolded sentence that I added in here, she was amazed at the transformation, was convinced the library had a hand in his development, is really great. Like that's a direct tie to like this individual transformation and how, the resource of the library might have supported that. Yeah, Kristen, exactly. It shows the impact of a library on child development. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really lovely example. We'll just carry on here because we've got a half hour left. So the next thing we're going to do is, after that second explainer story, we're going to make another ask. We're going to make that second ask to people who hopefully have read this second part and are like, oh, I need to donate to this. I would love to be a part of what this organization is doing. So for this second ask, one of the things that I like to do for this is definitely still make a very clear and compelling call to action so that supporters can go make a donation. But what I'll do is vary the language slightly to reflect the second explainer or the story in the letter. So it's not going to be the same copy that I wrote in the first one. It's going to be a little bit different. But again, still compelling, still giving people that reason to click through or reason to phone in and make a donation, whatever it is you'd like them to do. And lastly, I think one of the things that I always encourage people to do when they sign off on their letters is really bake in that attitude of gratitude, even before people make a gift. Like I always think it's like such an honor and a wonderful thing to have people donating to our causes. And I think really reflecting that attitude and that message at the bottom of a letter or an email, it can just be a sentence. It can be something super simple, but just being able to express that gratitude ahead of time, I think, is a really important thing to make donors feel appreciated before they've even taken that next step to make the gift. So what I'd like to do is actually show you an example that is not a library and not a cultural organization. This is a part of an appeal campaign that I worked on last fall. It's an email, and I'll just talk a little bit about it, what worked well in it. It's from an organization that works with children with special needs, so a very different type of organization than many of you are from. But I just thought it would give you an example, again, of just fundraising copywriting, and another example to think about for your own inspiration file. So this is, the organization is Variety BC. I've worked with them for about 2 years now. They're a nonprofit who provides grants to children and organizations, children who have special needs, and organizations who work with children who have special needs. And this campaign, this email was part of a campaign we did last fall, and it featured a really specific aspect of their work, which was to fund private autism assessments. And so obviously, like a complicated topic, we had to figure out how to explain this to people in a way that was going to make sense and be compelling. And one of the things I'll just talk about the top part of this letter, which is on the left side of the slide here. So it reads, fall is always an extremely busy time for Variety because we are not only receiving a lot of new grant applications, we are also renewing grant applications for children who continue to need our help. And the demand this fall has become even greater because we've begun funding private autism assessments. Okay, so there's our hook, right? We get right into this email. We already know that the organization is busy, there's a high demand for service, and it's even greater because of this new thing that we're doing. And so the explainer, the two paragraphs below that, get into why this particular area of funding is so important. So they talk about the public wait time. So it's about 2 years in British Columbia, where I live, for a child to be assessed through a public system. And they talk about the downsides of, like, if somebody doesn't have an assessment, what happens? Like, that child goes, without significant access to government funding that can help them in their early years or early school years. And the impact of that is something that's, really unfortunate. And yet having access to that is really essential to their development. So we're able to make a case for that. So why this is so necessary. And then they also talk about how, since they announced this new program, they've received hundreds of applications from families reaching out for helping hand. And unfortunately, it's more families than they can currently fund, right? So that establishes that there's a need. They have a solution. They can fund these private autism assessments, and they need more money to be able to do so. And that's why they're out with this email asking people to make a donation to this particular kind of program. And you can see the ask there. So I'll just say a couple things about this email really quickly in terms of formatting and tips for you if you are sending out emails to your email list for donations. A couple things that I do in email, obviously using bolded text is always really helpful. And even in direct mail letters too, like, it keeps the flow and the eye moving. I would just use it strategically, pick out key points that you want people to connect with. And then the other thing I do in email that I have tested that works extremely well compared to other things I've done over the years is, when you get to the ask and you're going to hyperlink over to your donate page, make sure you hyperlink an entire sentence. Don't just highlight the words like donate now or make your donation today. Really make it obvious. I would say, especially like if you think about, like, on mobile, like, it's such a small screen, being able to click on those words easily, you want people to be able to do that. So being able to find that call to action easily is a really important part of this. All right. Okay, I just wanted to take a look here real quick. Yeah, Rebecca, how do you make the distinction between municipally supported library services and what you're asking readers to support? Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So I would say that's part of what you can explain in your explainer, right? Like, what is municipally supported and what's not? Like, what are the things that would continue to enhance what is municipally supported, and being able to do some education there. I think what might be similar for your type of organization, and Variety, for example, is that, like, they are also working within a system where there's lots of things that are funded by government healthcare and covered by provincial healthcare. And they have to also make this distinction of what's covered and what's not, and, like, what's the value of covering these things versus, like, what what are the kind of the consequences of not covering them, like high costs, like all of these kinds of things. Yeah, that answers your question a little bit. Yeah. All right, so I'm conscientious of the time. I know I have a couple things to cover still, but I do want to give you maybe a couple minutes if you want, or maybe some of you have already been doing this, just to think about the flow of your own appeal. And you'll find this on the second page of your worksheet. There is an activity page that says the anatomy of your appeal. There's sections for each of these. And if you have a couple minutes here, I'll answer some questions while folks are doing some thinking about this. I would definitely encourage you to try writing your hook or even writing your first ask. I think those are really great ones to work on here. Yeah, and Susan, you said you do just that. You can fund programs and services that exceed the library budget, i.e. art exhibitions. Yeah, exactly. I would just think about how you can frame that as, like, this positive, like, you do receive a lot of funding, right, through your municipality, not a lot, but, like, you receive some amount of funding through the municipality that covers X, Y, and Z things. And there's still more you could do to enhance that experience, more that you can offer to the community above and beyond that budget. And that's where private donors come in to help. All right, I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving on just a little bit more. I want to talk about getting eyes on your campaign, which is a big part of all this as we kind of wrap up. This is where I always think fundraising starts to become more of a numbers game and more of a science, though not an overly complicated one. But this is about getting your letter out to people and in front of people, and starting to get some responses from them. As you think about this, I would absolutely encourage you to start with mail or email lists that you might have. If you're doing an annual appeal for the first time, I know many of you earlier on indicated that you have some of those assets already, which are great. And I would say, are any of you in a place right now where you're starting with no mail or no email list? Let me know in the chat if you are. Maybe just curious to see if that's true for any of the folks here. And if it is, that's totally okay. We'll talk about that. Yeah, Lori, no email list. Okay, yeah. Um, yeah, definitely, and that's no problem. So, but Lori, like if you have a mail list, obviously you can start with that, and you could build an email list over time if that's a channel that you wanted to expand into. So let me just give you some high-level advice for how to think about who are your best people to reach out to in a campaign. Um, so no matter where you're starting from, effective targeting is an important piece of the pie. This is this image here on the slide is the circles of influence from Henry Rousseau, which is a concept and an idea that the constituent groups that are closest to the center of your organization have the strongest connection to your organization and are more likely to give. And the further out you get, the less likely they are to give, and the harder it's going to be to convince them to give. So when you're starting to think from scratch, or you're starting to think about who could we reach out to, how could we expand our universe of constituents, how can we talk to more people, I find that this can be really helpful just to think through, to give you some ideas for organizing those audiences and organizing your campaign data. Again, I would encourage you to think about the groups closest into you and then expand out from there. If you are starting from scratch, like a lot of organizations are, which is fine. Again, like this is a great model to think about, right? So, your board, your management, people who are most closely connected to your organization will be the people who are most likely to give, for sure. All right, there we go. Never mind. There's a question there. But this can be helpful for just helping you organize that. And there is a checklist of this as well in your worksheets if you want to use that for reference and getting yourself organized. And lastly, I will say that fundraising definitely happens in the follow-up, which is why so many organizations use more than one mechanism to do fundraising with people. I would say that follow-up will certainly make your appeal more complicated, but it's probably going to increase your ability to get more donations. So there's definitely an upside to this, and I can talk about what that looks like. So what this could look like, one, you could follow up with non-responders. So these are the people who you asked once and haven't yet given. You could follow up through different channels. So if you mailed people, maybe you follow up with an email or a phone call a few weeks later. And you can, your follow-up can evolve with each appeal you run over time, right? So if this is your first time sending something out, maybe you just do the one ask. And then maybe in a year from now or 2 years from now, like you try some different things to engage people a little bit more. I will say that following up with non-responders on digital mediums like email is extremely easy to do and very low cost. So when I run campaigns for Variety BC, one of the strategies that we use throughout a campaign is we always follow up with non-openers. So if you use an email program like MailChimp or ActiveCampaign, any number of things like that, you can resend your email to people who did not open, and it will automatically find those people who received it but didn't open it, and it will kick it back up to the top of their inbox. This is something I always recommend to my clients and students to do because you can generally get an additional 10 to 15% of the original response rate just by sending the same email again. You don't have to make any updates to it. You don't have to change the subject line. If it did well and you were happy with it, I would resend the same thing. And that's an excellent way to get some more mileage out of work you've already done and ways that you can get some more donations in the door. Yeah, so those are just some excellent, simple ways that you can start to do some additional follow-up with people. There's certainly other mechanisms for this as well. I always think of them more as like marketing outreach that kind of overlap with our fundraising goals, things like social media, offline advertising, or offline promotions, things you might put in your space, signage, things like that, that can help support that fundraising campaign that you might be running. All right, so with that, as we wrap up, I'd love to take any final questions from all of you. I know we have covered a lot of information here today, but I hope that you are coming away with some really good ideas for what you can do for your appeal, some direction on how to write this in a really strong, compelling way, and hopefully some ideas for how you can continue to increase your follow-up with people and ultimately increase the amount of donations you get in. Okay. Yep. Okay, Christine, Friends of the Library. The Friends of the Library do a membership drive every April. Is it okay to raise membership fees slightly after explaining why? Absolutely. That can definitely be a type of appeal that you do if you're looking to raise more money. You know, that the language that you might use for people who are existing members might be a little different. Like your explainer might be like something about why you're raising the membership rate. Whereas if you're doing an acquisition piece to people who have not yet become members, they may not need a big explanation as to why the membership rate's going up, but they may need more of an explanation as to why it's beneficial to become a friend of the library member. And Brenda, yeah, what do you think about putting an announcement in your newsletter reminding people to remember your local library in your estate planning? You could absolutely do that. Yeah, I think you could just think about like what are your priorities in terms of how quickly you get money in the door. Like obviously, gift and estate planning is a long range game. Like that can sometimes take years, if not decades, to manifest an actual money for your organization. But if that is something that's a priority for you, a program you're trying to build, then yes, you could absolutely build some marketing campaign around that and making sure that that's a little bit more top of mind for people. Yeah, Charlene, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for a mail service for annual appeal letters? I don't, and I probably should have thought about that for you. I work with mostly mail houses local to my area, but I am sure that there are many in the New York region. People in the group today might even have ones that they use. So I would definitely, if folks have suggestions, one that they're using, I would welcome you to share those. Yeah, and I would, I'll just say too, for folks, maybe you don't have a question right now, maybe after today's webinar, you'll be like, I wish I would have asked that, or something comes up. I'd welcome you to email me anytime. It's why I always include my information here on this last slide. My email address is vanessa@thestorytellingnonprofit.com. I always tell people after trainings, if you have a question a week from now, a month from now, please feel free to follow up with me. I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards.
Thank you, everyone. I think this was wonderful, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Vanessa. This has been great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
It all happened. So
yeah.
See you later, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.